In this lesson, we're going to continue refactoring the logic related to the routing. And the first thing what we will do is actually move normalize page hash function into router.js module, because currently this function is defined inside of functions.js module, but in fact, since it is used only within router.js, it might make more sense to move the definition of this function into router.js module. And this way we're going to increase encapsulation of this module. So let's just cut this function from here, move it into router.js, and since this function also uses validation function isPageValid, therefore we have to import this function. So let's go ahead and copy the import of this function from functions.js, move it into router.js, and remove unused import of this function from this import statement, as well as the constant page timeline. And also we no longer have to import normalize page hash function, so we can remove this import as well, because we have moved definition of this function inside router.js module. And before actually proceeding any further, let's make sure that our navigation works. By clicking on navigation links, as we can see, we are navigated to different pages, so we can continue. Now let's open up the header component and do a little refactoring in here. Let's take a look at these two components, the logo and the header progress. As we can see, we have two event listeners registered on these components, and each event listener is responsible for navigating to a different page. But we can actually move registration of these listeners directly within corresponding components. For example, let's cut this click listener from here and put it directly on the link located inside of the logo component right here. This way logic will stay the same anyway. And also we have to copy over into this component function called navigate. So let's copy over this import, move it inside of the logo component, and let's just do the same with another listener registered on the header progress component by cutting this registration and move it directly on the root element of the header progress component, like so. And also the same import of the navigate function we need to add into this component. And now let's go back to the header component, and as we can see here we have two unused constant that can safely be removed. And this way we were able to make this component much cleaner. We don't have any event registrations in here. And we were able to do so by moving individual event listeners of click event into corresponding components and placing those listeners directly on the root elements of these components. So let's just make sure that while clicking on links in the header, we are properly navigated to corresponding pages. And this works as before, as we can see. Next, let's work on the logic, which is responsible for scrolling the page to a particular timeline item when we are clicking on our labels in here. So the logic which is responsible for scrolling to a particular timeline item is located inside of the timeline component, and particularly this is the function scrollToHour. And here we can also apply little refactoring by reducing amount of code in this function. So let's do this. We're going to declare a new constant called el. And depending on the value of the hour variable, when it will be equal to midnight hour. And as we know, midnight hour constant stores value 0. So if this expression will be true, we're going to assign to the constant called el reference to the body element. Otherwise, we're going to use the expression, which lets us get a reference for a particular timeline item DOM element, and use this expression in here. So what we have done in here is we stored value of a particular DOM element that we need to scroll the page to inside of el constant. And now we don't need to write any extra conditions. We can just call method scrollIntoView directly on the DOM element stored inside the el constant, like this. And this way we're getting the same behavior as was previously written above by using that if conditional block. We just need to pass options into this scrollIntoView method. We can just copy this options object and paste it directly as the first parameter to this method. So as we can see, we haven't changed the logic of this function. What we have done is actually simplified it and made it more compact. And of course, now we need to make sure that when clicking on our labels, we're still scrolled to individual timeline items. And as we can see, it is working. And after initial page load, we're also scrolled to the current timeline item. So our previous behavior is working fine. Let's continue development in the next lesson.